I think it's time we clear something up, Mom. My son said those words on Christmas Eve, standing beside the tree I had decorated the way I always do, with white lights and the old glass ornaments his father and I collected over 40 years of marriage. Daniel held out a small rectangular box wrapped in silver paper, too small to be a sweater, too deliberate to be an afterthought, and I remember noticing how carefully he washed my face as I took it from his hands. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey, the same way it had every December since we moved into this Connecticut colonial back in 1989, and for a brief second I allowed myself to believe this was simply another modern gift from a son who works in tech and likes gadgets. I smiled, because that is what mothers do when their grown children hand them something unexpected. A DNA kit, I said lightly after reading the label, turning the box over in my hands. That's creative. Emily stood near the fireplace, her posture too straight, her wine glass untouched. She didn't laugh. Daniel didn't either. It could be fun, he replied. You've always talked about Grandpa's side of the family. I thought we could learn more. Fun. The word floated between us, thin as the tinsel draped along the mantel. I have lived 72 years, long enough to recognize when curiosity is genuine and when it is sharpened into something else. My son's jaw was tight. His fingers tapped once against the back of a dining chair, a habit he picked up as a teenager whenever he was waiting for an answer he thought he already knew. I set the box down carefully on the coffee table, aligning it with the edge as if it were part of the decor. That's thoughtful, I said. Very 21st century. He didn't sit. He stayed standing, towering over the room that once held his train sets and Little League trophies. The Christmas lights blinked softly, casting red and gold reflections across the framed photographs on the wall. Robert in his Navy uniform at 22, Daniel at age 5 with a gap-toothed grin. The three of us on Cape Cod the summer before college changed everything. I wondered which of those memories he had already begun to question. I already did mine, Daniel added, too quickly. There it was. Not a shared adventure. A comparison. My hands, steady as ever, folded in my lap. Robert used to say that blood is only part of a story, and that loyalty is the rest. I didn't understand why he repeated that phrase during his final year, when illness had thinned his voice, but not his resolve. Now, with a plastic testing tube sitting beside a bowl of cranberries, I felt the echo of those words pressing against my ribs. Is there something you're worried about? I asked gently. Emily shifted her weight. The fire popped once, a sharp crack in an otherwise silent room. Daniel finally sat down across from me, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. I just think, he said slowly, that after Dad passed, there are things we never really talked about. His eyes searched mine, not with anger, but with calculation. It struck me then that this was not about ancestry websites or distant cousins in Ohio. It was about certainty, about whether the foundation beneath his feet was poured in concrete or sand. I picked up the DNA kit again, running my thumb along the sealed edge. Outside, a thin layer of snow covered the driveway, smooth and undisturbed, like a page waiting for a signature. Christmas Eve, I said quietly. That's an interesting night to start digging into the past. Daniel didn't smile. It felt like the right time. Perhaps it did for him. For me, it felt like the moment before a storm, when the air grows heavy and even the house seems to hold its breath. I did not argue. I did not refuse. I simply nodded, because sometimes the calmest response is the one that unsettles people the most. And as I placed the small silver box back onto the table, I realized that whatever my son believed he was about to uncover, he had already begun to expose something far more fragile than DNA. After Daniel left that night, taking Emily with him and promising that we would talk more after the holidays, I remained in the living room long after the last strand of Christmas lights had gone dark. The DNA kit sat on the coffee table like an unopened letter from the past, small and ordinary, yet heavy enough to tilt the balance of an entire family. I did not open it. Instead, I walked through the house slowly, turning off lamps one by one, pausing at the hallway mirror where I caught a glimpse of myself in the dim reflection. 72 years old, silver hair neatly pinned, posture still straight. I did not look like a woman hiding a secret. I looked like a widow who had kept a home steady for more than 3 decades. Robert and I bought this house when Daniel was 4 years old. It cost $185,000 at the time, which felt enormous to us. Robert said it was an investment in stability. He believed that a child should grow up knowing that the walls around him would not suddenly disappear. I remember Daniel racing his bicycle down the driveway, the training wheels rattling against the pavement, Robert jogging behind him with one hand hovering near the seat. That was the kind of father he was in every visible way. Present, steady, proud. So when Daniel mentioned that he had already taken his own DNA test, I heard something beneath his words that had little to do with curiosity. Doubt does not arrive overnight. It builds quietly, like frost along the edge of a window. I began to wonder when it had started. Perhaps after Robert passed away 2 years ago, when grief rearranged everything. Or perhaps earlier, in small moments I had dismissed. There were times during Robert's final year when he would look at Daniel with an expression I could not quite read. Not disappointment, not distance, something closer to contemplation. Once, while we were sitting at the kitchen table reviewing insurance papers, Robert said, "If anything ever challenges what we have built, promise me you will not let it tear you apart." I had assumed he was speaking about finances or property taxes or the endless paperwork that follows a diagnosis. I did not imagine he meant this. The next morning, Christmas Day, I made coffee as usual and placed the DNA kit beside the toaster. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, catching the thin layer of snow on the backyard fence. Everything looked calm, ordinary. I read the instructions carefully, twice. A simple cheek swab, a prepaid envelope, results in 4 to 6 weeks. It was remarkable how something so clinical could carry such emotional weight. I could have refused. I could have told Daniel that trust should not require laboratory confirmation. But refusal would have sounded like fear, and fear would have confirmed whatever story he had begun telling himself. So I completed the test with steady hands and sealed the envelope. At the post office on Main Street, I slid it across the counter to a young clerk who could not have been more than 25. She weighed it, printed a receipt, and wished me a happy holiday. To her, it was just another package. To me, it felt like mailing a fragment of my past to strangers who would measure it in percentages and probabilities. When I stepped back outside, the cold air stung my cheeks, sharp and clarifying. I realized then that whatever the results revealed, the true fracture had already formed. My son had not given me a gift. He had given me a question, and questions, once asked, rarely return quietly to where they began. The weeks that followed moved with an uncomfortable stillness, as if the house itself were waiting for an answer. January settled over Connecticut in layers of gray sky and brittle air, the kind that makes every sound sharper. I kept to my routines. I walked 2 miles each morning along the quiet streets of our neighborhood, past identical mailboxes and bare maple trees, nodding to neighbors who had known Daniel since he was a boy. I attended Sunday service, sat in the same pew Robert and I had occupied for years, and listened to sermons about faith and patience. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, I could feel the slow ticking of an unseen clock. Daniel did not call during the first week after Christmas. That, more than the DNA kit itself, told me how deeply this question had taken root in him. When he finally did reach out, it was through a brief message asking whether I had mailed the sample. I replied that I had, and that the company estimated 4 to 6 weeks for results. His response came quickly. "Thank you." No warmth. No follow-up. Just confirmation that the process was in motion. I began to revisit memories with a precision I had not allowed myself before. Daniel was born in the spring of 1986, after a long night at Hartford Hospital and a delivery that left me exhausted but grateful. Robert held him first, tears in his eyes, whispering that he had never been so proud. There had never been a question then. Not in the hospital room. Not during Daniel's first steps across our living room carpet. Not when Robert taught him how to shave at 16, standing side by side in the upstairs bathroom mirror. If there had been doubt, Robert buried it so deeply that even I did not see it. One afternoon in late January, I opened the small fireproof safe in the hall closet to retrieve our property deed for tax preparation. Inside were documents I had organized carefully after Robert passed away. Insurance policies, bank statements, and an envelope in Robert's handwriting, dated 3 months before his death. I did not open it immediately. I simply held it, tracing the familiar slant of his pen. The memory of his final winter returned to me with unsettling clarity. He had grown quieter, often sitting by the window in the den, watching the snow gather along the hedges. Once, When Daniel had left after a short visit, Robert remained standing at the front door long after the car disappeared down the street. I had asked him what he was thinking. He replied, "Some truths do not need to be spoken to be carried." At the time, I assumed he meant the weight of illness, the unspoken fear of leaving us behind. Now, I wondered if he had been carrying something else entirely. February arrived with heavy snowfall, nearly 12 inches in a single weekend, forcing me to shovel the driveway in careful intervals. The physical effort steadied me. There is comfort in tasks that require focus. Meanwhile, Daniel grew more distant. When we spoke, he asked practical questions about timelines and email notifications, as though we were discussing a business transaction rather than the foundation of his identity. Emily never called. I sensed her presence in the background of every conversation, quiet but influential. Doubt rarely grows alone. It is often nurtured by suggestion. And as the days narrowed toward the promised results, I understood that whatever numbers appeared on that report, they would not simply measure genetic markers. They would measure trust, loyalty, and the story my son had chosen to believe about his own beginnings. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March while I was standing at the kitchen counter slicing apples for a pie I did not particularly feel like baking. The subject line was neutral, almost polite, informing me that my DNA results were ready to view. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, noticing how ordinary everything looked around me. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked toward 10:15. Outside, the last patches of snow were shrinking into damp, gray shadows along the driveway. It struck me how quietly life continues even when something significant is about to unfold. I did not open the report immediately. Instead, I washed my hands, dried them carefully, and carried my laptop to the dining room table where Robert and I had once reviewed mortgage documents and college tuition statements. I logged into the account with steady fingers and clicked on the results. Percentages and charts filled the screen. Ethnicity estimates, regional breakdowns, distant cousin matches. I scrolled until I found the section that mattered most. Parent-child comparison. The words were clinical. The conclusion was not. There was no biological link between Robert Whitmore and Daniel Whitmore. I read the sentence twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to observe my own reaction. My pulse did not race. My breathing did not falter. What I felt was something quieter, almost reflective. A confirmation of the possibility that had hovered over the past weeks like a low cloud. I closed the laptop before Daniel could call. I knew he would have received his notification at the same time. He arrived less than an hour later, his sedan pulling into the driveway with more speed than necessary. I watched from the front window as he stepped out, shoulders rigid, phone still in his hand. When I opened the door, he did not offer a greeting. He walked past me into the living room as though he had rehearsed this moment. "You saw it," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the rug Robert and I had purchased in Vermont decades ago. "It says there is 0% match," he continued, his voice controlled but tight. "That means Dad was not my biological father." I folded my hands together, the same way I had on Christmas Eve. "That is what the report indicates." He stopped pacing and looked at me directly, searching for something in my expression. "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question hung between us, heavier than any accusation spoken aloud. I understood what he was implying, yet he had not said the word. He did not need to. Doubt had already shaped it. I met his gaze without raising my voice. "Daniel, your father loved you every single day of his life. That has not changed." He exhaled sharply. "That is not what I asked." I could see the conflict in him, the struggle between loyalty to the man who raised him and the unsettling mathematics of a laboratory result. "I never questioned who your father was," I said evenly. "Not for a single day." He turned away, walking toward the fireplace where our family photographs still stood. His eyes lingered on a picture of Robert teaching him how to tie a fishing knot on a dock in Maine. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the heating system. Finally he spoke again, quieter this time. "Then how do you explain this?" I did not answer immediately, because explanations are not the same as truths, and I was beginning to realize that the truth Daniel was preparing to accept might not be the one he expected. Daniel remained standing near the fireplace, his back partially turned toward me, as though the photographs lining the mantel might offer him an answer I would not. I could see the tension in the way his shoulders rose and fell with each breath. Explain it to me, he said again, quieter now, but more insistent. I rose from my chair slowly and walked to the hallway closet where the small fireproof safe was kept. I did not rush. Calm unsettles people more than anger ever could. Kneeling down, I entered the combination and opened the metal door, retrieving the envelope I had found weeks earlier. Robert's handwriting curved across the front, unmistakable and steady despite the illness he had been battling at the time. I carried it back to the dining room table and placed it between us. Your father wrote this 3 months before he passed, I said. Daniel looked at the envelope but did not touch it. What is it? He asked. Something he wanted kept safe. I slid it toward him. He hesitated only a second before tearing it open. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of paper. His eyes moved across the page quickly at first, then more slowly, as though the words were rearranging themselves into something he had not anticipated. I watched his expression shift from certainty to confusion. Robert's letter was not dramatic. It did not contain accusations or confessions. It was written in the same measured tone he used when balancing the checkbook or explaining an investment. He stated that during a routine medical evaluation many years ago, a discrepancy had surfaced that suggested a possible error in hospital records from the time of Daniel's birth. He wrote that he had pursued the matter quietly, requesting additional information, but that the documentation from that period had been incomplete. He acknowledged that the question of biological connection had crossed his mind, yet he emphasized that fatherhood, in his view, was defined by commitment rather than chromosomes. Daniel lowered the letter slowly. He knew, he asked, disbelief edging his voice. He suspected, I corrected gently. There is a difference. Daniel shook his head, pacing again, but this time his movements lacked the sharpness from earlier. Why did you never tell me? He demanded. Because your father chose not to pursue it further, I replied. He decided that what mattered was the life we had built. He believed reopening the question would only create damage. Daniel looked at me as if trying to measure the truth of my words against the data on his phone. So you are saying this could be some kind of mistake? He asked. I folded my hands on the table. I am saying that hospitals in 1986 did not operate with the same digital precision they do now. Records were paper. Mistakes happened. Your father considered that possibility. Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing the implication. But the DNA report, he began. The DNA report compares samples submitted today, I said calmly. It does not account for what may have happened in a maternity ward nearly 4 decades ago. The idea seemed to catch him off guard. His anger, which had been aimed directly at me, began to shift into uncertainty. Are you suggesting? He started, then stopped. I did not complete the sentence for him. Instead, I met his gaze steadily. I am suggesting that before you decide what this result means about your mother, you consider what it might mean about a hospital error no one investigated thoroughly. The room grew quiet again. Outside, a delivery truck passed down the street, ordinary and unaware of the fragile conversation unfolding inside our home. Daniel looked back at the letter in his hands, reading certain lines again. The certainty he had arrived with was no longer as firm. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I saw doubt not about his origin, but about the conclusions he had been so ready to draw. Daniel remained seated at the dining room table long after he finished reading Robert's letter, holding the paper as if it might rearrange itself into something simpler. The certainty that had fueled his arrival was fading, replaced by something more fragile. If there was a mistake at the hospital, he said slowly, why did Dad not push harder? I considered the question carefully before answering. Because he had already decided who his son was, I replied. He did not need a laboratory to confirm what he lived every day. Daniel looked down at his hands, the same broad hands Robert once guided across a baseball glove in our backyard. That does not explain why he kept it from me, he said. It explains exactly why, I answered gently. He believed the knowledge would not serve you. He thought it would only plant doubt where none was needed. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were leaning inward to hear the rest. Daniel stood and walked toward the kitchen window, staring out at the damp yard where snow had nearly disappeared. So what are you saying? He asked without turning around. That I might not be yours either? The question was sharp, but not cruel. It carried fear more than accusation. I rose and joined him by the window. I carried you for 9 months, I said evenly. I remember every appointment, every craving, every restless night. There was never any confusion about that. He nodded faintly, but his shoulders remained tense. Then if the report is correct, he pressed, that means he did not finish. I did not allow silence to harden into assumption. It means we have incomplete information, I said. And it means we do not yet know where the error occurred. Daniel turned to face me fully now. There is only one way to know, he said. We test again. A clinical test. Not one ordered online. I studied him carefully. The anger that once pointed at me had transformed into determination. If that is what you need, I replied, then we will do it properly. His eyes searched mine for resistance. He did not find any. You are not upset? He asked quietly. I allowed a small pause before answering. Of course I am, I said. But not because of the test. I am upset because you believed for a moment that I would lie to you about something so fundamental. He lowered his gaze. The words landed heavier than accusation ever could. Emily thought it was strange, he admitted after a moment. She said maybe there were things you never told us. There it was. Not malice, but suggestion. A seed planted carefully. I did not react with anger. Marriage is full of opinions, I said calmly. But conclusions should not be built on suspicion alone. Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing the shift in tone. I should not have assumed, he said, the words reluctant but sincere. You should not have, I agreed. But we are here now. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking the passage of a conversation that had begun as confrontation and was now turning into inquiry. I will contact Hartford Hospital, Daniel said at last. There have been cases of record discrepancies from the 1980s. I have read about it. I nodded once. Then let us begin there. As he gathered his coat, his movements were less rigid than when he arrived. The certainty that once isolated him from me had softened into shared uncertainty. And as the front door closed behind him, I realized that the true test before us was no longer about genetic markers. It was about whether a lifetime of devotion could withstand a question introduced by doubt. Daniel moved quickly once a new course had been decided. Within a week, he had contacted Hartford Hospital, requesting archived maternity records from April of 1986. The administrator explained that many documents from that era had been transferred to microfilm and later digitized, and that retrieval could take time. Daniel insisted. He mentioned legal review. He used the steady, controlled tone he reserved for business negotiations. I listened from the kitchen as he made the call, standing only a few feet away but saying nothing. When he ended it, he looked at me differently than he had in March. Not as an accuser, not even as a son. Seeking confession. He looked like a man confronting the possibility that his certainty had been misplaced. 2 weeks later we sat together in a small consultation room at the hospital, a space furnished with neutral chairs and a rectangular table that had likely held countless private conversations. A records supervisor joined us, a woman in her late 50s who spoke carefully and avoided speculation. She explained that during the mid-1980s, the hospital had transitioned between identification systems for newborns. Paper wristbands were replaced with newer tagging procedures. In rare cases, she admitted, documentation inconsistencies had occurred. She emphasized that confirmed cases of infant misidentification were extremely uncommon, but she did not say they were impossible. Daniel leaned forward, absorbing each word. Are there any notes in my file indicating a discrepancy? He asked. The supervisor hesitated before answering. There is an annotation added approximately 6 years after your birth, she said, sliding a copy of a scanned record across the table. I felt Daniel's arm tense beside mine. The note referenced a parental inquiry about blood type incompatibility discovered during a routine pediatric appointment. Further testing at that time had produced inconclusive results due to limited technology. The file showed that no additional action had been taken. Daniel read the page twice. My father requested this, he asked quietly. The supervisor nodded. According to the file, yes. There it was. Not suspicion of betrayal, but concern about a medical inconsistency. A father investigating quietly, without accusation, without drama. Daniel sat back slowly, the weight of that detail settling into him. So he did try, he murmured. I kept my voice even. He wanted clarity. He simply chose not to disturb your childhood in the process. The supervisor added that modern DNA comparison between archived parental samples was not possible because no biological material had been preserved from that era. However, she suggested a comprehensive hospital audit might reveal additional administrative irregularities from the same week, in April 1986. Daniel requested that review immediately. As we left the hospital, the afternoon sun reflected off the parking lot, bright and almost disorienting after the subdued lighting of the consultation room. Daniel paused before unlocking his car. "I thought I was uncovering something you hid," he said quietly. "But it looks like Dad was protecting something instead." I met his gaze. "He was protecting you," I replied. "From uncertainty he could not fully resolve." Daniel nodded slowly. The narrative he had constructed since Christmas Eve was shifting, not collapsing entirely, but rearranging. Doubt had once pointed toward me. Now it pointed toward an institutional error buried in outdated procedures and incomplete records. As we drove home along Interstate 91, traffic moving steadily at 60 miles per hour, I felt a subtle change in the air between us. For the first time in months, we were not sitting on opposite sides of a question. We were facing it together. The hospital audit took nearly a month to complete, and during that time Daniel called more often than he had in the previous year combined. Not with accusations, not with urgency, but with updates. There was something grounding about hearing him speak in measured tones again, discussing documentation timelines and archival procedures instead of percentages on a commercial website. One evening in late April, he came by the house with a folder tucked under his arm. The dogwood tree in the front yard had begun to bloom, white petals scattered across the lawn like small, deliberate reminders that seasons move forward whether we are ready or not. We sat at the dining room table, the same place where this question first shifted from suspicion to inquiry. Daniel opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of internal memos from the hospital dated within days of his birth. One memo referenced a temporary labeling malfunction in the maternity ward after a supply shipment error led to mismatched identification bands. The language was cautious but clear. The issue had been identified and corrected within 48 hours. Families affected were to be notified if discrepancies were confirmed. Daniel looked up at me, his expression no longer guarded but unsettled in a different way. "There were 3 births within an hour of mine," he said quietly. 2 boys and 1 girl. One of the boys had a documented blood type that did not match the recorded parental types. He paused, letting the implication settle between us. That boy was listed under our last name in the original log. I felt the air in the room shift, not with shock, but with a strange sense of inevitability. "And the correction?" I asked. Daniel flipped to another page. The corrected entry was filed 2 days later. It states that the initial identification was inaccurate and that families were contacted. He met my eyes steadily. "There is no record that Dad received that notification." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the quiet weight of it. Robert had pursued an inconsistency years later without knowing the full administrative error that had occurred days after Daniel's birth. He had carried doubt not because he distrusted me, but because the system had failed to provide clarity. "So it was not about betrayal," Daniel said slowly. "It was about a mistake." His voice held something close to relief, though it was not simple relief. It was layered with regret. "A mistake that no one fully explained," I replied. Daniel closed the folder carefully. "I was ready to believe something else," he admitted. The confession was soft, but it filled the room. I did not rush to respond. Outside, a light breeze moved through the budding branches, brushing gently against the window. "You were ready to believe that your mother had lied to you for nearly 40 years, I said evenly. He lowered his gaze. "I let doubt speak louder than history," he answered. The honesty in his tone carried more weight than any apology could. "Your father faced the same uncertainty," I said. "But he chose to protect the life he knew rather than chase a possibility he could not prove." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding settling into him not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual alignment of facts. The DNA report had been accurate in its calculation. What it had lacked was context. And context, I realized, is often what keeps families intact. As we sat there in the quiet dining room, the power dynamic that had shifted months ago returned to balance. Not because the results were overturned, but because the truth had been placed where it belonged. Not in suspicion, not in accusation, but in understanding. By early May the dogwood blossoms had fallen, and the air carried the first steady warmth of approaching summer. Daniel came to the house one Saturday afternoon without a folder in his hands and without tension in his shoulders. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. looking around as if seeing the living room not as a battleground of suspicion, but as the place where he had built forts out of couch cushions and fallen asleep during Sunday football games beside his father. "I owe you an apology," he said, and this time the words were not measured for effect. They were simple and unguarded. I invited him to sit, and we returned to the dining room table that had quietly witnessed every stage of this unraveling. "I let a laboratory result rewrite 40 years of memory," he continued. "I convinced myself that numbers meant more than experience. I listened without interrupting. There is power in allowing someone to finish their own realization. Emily thought we needed clarity," he added after a moment. "She believed transparency was healthier than silence. I agreed with her." He paused, then looked directly at me. "But I should have come to you with trust instead of suspicion." I folded my hands calmly on the table. "Clarity is not wrong," I said. "But clarity without context can be dangerous." He nodded slowly. "Dad knew there was an inconsistency," he said. "He investigated quietly. He carried it without turning it into a weapon." The respect in his voice when he spoke about Robert was steady again, no longer fractured by doubt. "Your father understood something important," I replied. "He knew that fatherhood is built in daily choices, not in laboratory percentages." Daniel exhaled, as though releasing the final weight he had been holding since Christmas Eve. "When I gave you that kit," he admitted, "I thought I was uncovering a hidden truth. I did not realize I was testing the foundation of our family." I allowed a brief silence before answering. "And what did you learn?" I asked. He did not hesitate this time. "That trust is stronger than suspicion when you give it a chance." The afternoon sunlight filtered across the table, illuminating the faint scratches in the wood left by decades of shared meals and conversations. "There may still be questions about what happened in that hospital," Daniel continued. "But those questions do not define who raised me." His voice was steady. "Dad chose me. You chose me. That matters more than a record from 1986. I felt a quiet sense of resolution settle in the room. Not dramatic, not triumphant, simply firm. "Families survive uncertainty when they remember what was proven in action," I said. Daniel stood and walked to the mantel, studying the photograph of Robert in his Navy uniform. "I almost reduced him to a statistic," he said softly. "And I almost reduced you to a suspect." He turned back to me, eyes clear. "I am sorry." This time I nodded. "Apology accepted," I replied, not as a concession but as a boundary restored. The power shift that had begun months earlier completed itself in that moment. I had not defended myself with anger. I had not pleaded for belief. I had simply remained steady until the truth aligned itself. As Daniel prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Blood makes relatives," he said, recalling something his father once told him. "But loyalty makes family." I offered a small, knowing smile. "Now you understand," I answered. And as the door closed behind him, I realized that the greatest revelation had never been hidden in a DNA report. It had always been visible in the life we chose to build together.